Thank you very much, Les, and let me begin by thanking the Institute for extending me the invitation to come and speak this evening. It's always a great pleasure to talk about defence issues, and at this point in time, I think defence has gone off the radar in a lot of ways. So I'm very encouraged that at least there are some people who are interested in how billions of dollars of taxpayers' money is being spent and might be spent in the future. This evening, what I want to try and do is three things. First of all, I want to talk in some detail about defence spending. Forgive me for coming up with charts and barraging you with numbers, but it's an essential part of the story. Defence is ultimately a practical activity. It's about taking resources and delivering capability. The situation we're in at the moment is worthy of some investigation. Then I want to really segue into canvassing a few issues which I hope will precipitate some discussion this evening, because I'd be very interested to see what people in the real world, I come from Canberra, not the real world, what people in the real world think about some defence issues, and I'm really going to go back to a blank sheet of paper in some ways and ask about living within our means in a defence context by asking questions about just what it is that we want to defend against. What are the sort of strategies that Australia can realistically adopt in the defence sector? And finally, I want to try and outline some of the things I think will happen over the next few years. And I don't know whether what I'm going to be telling you there is optimism or pessimism. I'll let you decide. Let me just put that up there and we'll refer to it in a moment. Things change quickly in the world of politics and government policy. 12 months ago, it looked as though the government had all but abandoned the ambitious plans that it had set out for the Defence Force back in its 2009 white paper under Kevin Rudd. More than $20 billion of promised funding had been deferred over the 3-year period between 2009 and 2012. As a result, last year, defence funding suffered its largest year-on-year cut since the withdrawal of Australian forces from Korea in 1953. 10.4% year-on-year cut. As a result, defence spending fell to its lowest level since 1938, the year of the Nuremberg rallies. This year, 12 months later, things look very different. You can see here, just to orient you to the graph here, we've got billions of dollars all converted into current year dollars, so inflation's been taken into account. You can see the rise in defence spending in the decade following East Timor and the attacks of 9/11, the growth under John Howard, a little bit of a spurt up here at the end of the decade, and then we come into the period of the cuts that occurred. I'll explain why the cuts occurred in a little while. What's happening now is defence spending is again on the rise, and this is next financial year, which begins on July 1, and there's the 3 years which follow, the so-called forward estimates. Not only is defence spending on the rise, but the government has released a new defence white paper, and critically, and I'll come to explain this in more detail, in doing so they've recommitted themselves to almost all of the goals of the 2009 white paper. On current plans, the defence budget will increase by 2.3% next year to reach $25.4 billion. And then it will continue to grow for another 3 years to reach $28.6 billion at the end of the 4-year period, all measured in dollars. That's an average rate of growth over the 4 years of 3.6%. That's stronger growth than was delivered back here in the big expansion and modernisation of the Defence Force last decade under John Howard. But that's only the start. If the government makes good on the foreshadowed $220 billion of financial guidance it's promised for the 6 years which follow out here beyond the forward estimates, you see it there, there's enough money to grow the defence budget to $33.2 billion by 2022 at a real annual rate of growth for that 6-year period of about 2.5%. Now, on the surface, that's pretty impressive, but don't pop the champagne corks just yet. This growth is built upon a hole that was dug. A hole that was dug back here, over this period here, but most especially in this year, financial year we're in now, by the government in their attempt to return the Commonwealth's finances to surplus this financial year. All up over 48 months, about $20 billion of funding was either cut and returned to Treasury or deferred to somewhere in the future, unspecified. It'll be 2 years yet before we re-establish the sort of spending levels we had back in 2011, 2012. Because of the secrecy surrounding defence funding back in 2009, it's difficult to say what the difference is between the funding that's now available and the funding that was promised back in 2009. But if we take the 2009 commitment at face value, and it was a very succinct statement, it said we'll grow the defence budget at 3% per annum above inflation out to 2018, and then we'll grow the defence budget by 2.2% above inflation out to 2030, you can make an estimate of the difference. And there it is. There's a deficit between 2009 and 2022 of about $33 billion. Now, there's different ways to do this calculation. There's some uncertainty about what was promised back then, but the sort of figures you get are in the vicinity of $20 to $30 billion over that period of time. It's not surprising, therefore, that the defence share of GDP over the next decade will rattle around between about 1.6 and 1.7. We'll get nowhere near the sort of 2% figures that a lot of people bandy around. Of course, GDP share is a poor measure of the adequacy of defence funding. It has a lot of symbolic value, but it doesn't really tell you whether you've got enough money to do what you want to do. What really matters is the harmony, the comparison, the consistency between the amount of money available and the plans which the government has in place. The short answer is that as a result of this budget, there is a manifest mismatch between the funding that's been promised and the plans that are set out for the Defence Force. Here's the thing, the scale and sophistication of the Defence Force has not appreciably changed since 2009. In fact, in some key areas, it's grown. The new white paper announced the purchase of 12 Growler-equipped Super Hornet fighter aircraft. In addition, it announced that it would keep those aircraft and the Super Hornets, which were a fleet of aircraft that were bought back in 2007, 24 of them, would keep those 36 aircraft in service all the way up to 2030, and go ahead with the purchase of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. Don't worry about all the numbers, the designations of the aircraft. What matters is that we were going to have one fleet of combat aircraft, and now we're going to have 2 fleets of combat aircraft. The numbers probably won't change all that much in total. We'll compromise on one fleet of aircraft to fund the other. But what we're stuck with now is the fixed cost of ownership of 2 fleets of aircraft. So we need 2 training systems, 2 sets of simulators, 2 sets of maintenance equipment, 2 sets of intellectual property legal arrangements to put in place, so on and so forth. It was a fundamental part of the plan that was put forward last decade that we would consolidate around 1 fleet. Now it's accepted we'll have 2 fleets. There will be substantial additional costs as a result of that decision. Similarly, in this year's white paper, the government reconfirmed its intention to replace our present 6 Collins-class submarines with 12 new submarines. Moreover, they narrowed the range of options they were going to consider. Previously, the range of options went from off-the-shelf submarines, that is, we build under licence a current European design, a modest expansion or redesign of a European submarine, and then 2 more costly and more risky alternatives, one being a substantial evolution of the Collins class by Kockums, the Swedish equipment manufacturer that designed the Collins in the first place, and an ab initio blank sheet of paper design. Well, the government has just narrowed its options down to those last two options. So we're committing ourselves to both high costs and high risks. In addition, back in 2011, the government commissioned a force posture review. Force posture review came back with a very, very long list of work to be done. Remediation of airfields, expansion of ports. And I'm not talking about things that are nice to haves. I'm talking about making sure that Darwin is a suitable port for the embarkation of troops on the two large amphibious vessels that are presently being fitted out down in Williamstown. Pretty basic bread and butter stuff. Similarly for the airfields, ensuring the airfields across the north of Australia are suitable, can provide support and fuel, not just for our fighter aircraft, but our newly acquired AIIA aircraft and our air-to-air refuelling aircraft. Big money involved in all of those efforts. So here's the bottom line. If the 2009 white paper was affordable, it probably wasn't, but that's another story. But let's assume for the moment it was affordable. It follows that with more capability and less money, the current white paper is manifestly unaffordable. The same conclusion can be reached, quite by independent means, by looking at what it costs to maintain a state-of-the-art military force. Here's a chart of some wonderful data from the United States, which goes back to 1951. What we have here, the dot points here, are the cost per active service vessel in the US Navy from 1951 through to 2011. So it takes the entire US Navy budget, capital, personnel, operating, fuel, food, everything, and it simply divides by the number of vessels and gets a cost per vessel. And you can see the long-term trend here is commensurate with around 3% real growth. Now I can do the same sort of curve. I've got the data for US troops, for US combat aircraft, for a whole range of things where you can divide a number by a number of assets, and you find over time the real cost of maintaining cutting-edge military equipment, that is, military equipment which has a relative advantage to other people's equipment available around the world at that point in time, increases by 3 to 4% per annum. Now remember what I said about the 6 years, 2.5%. We'll be lucky with 2.5% to tread water, to maintain the force we have, let alone keep it modern and expand it in very elaborate, very expensive ways, such as the doubling of the size of our submarine fleet. Now, to the extent there's been a debate over defence policy in recent days, and it's been very muted, that debate has been very cautious and low-key. Both sides of politics aspire to spend 2% of GDP. They don't say why that's a good idea, it's just an iconic figure that they like to bandy around. My thought is we could get away with spending less. But they put a big caveat on it. They say we want to spend that when economic circumstances allow. More critically, neither side of politics is willing to do one of the two things that would close the gap I've just explained to you. Two things are front up with more money, or say, okay, our priorities for the Defence Force going forward are these are the capabilities we will forego. Neither side is willing to do that. So what we have at this point in time is nothing short of bipartisan make-believe. Now, things could get worse. And I think in some ways they will get worse. This year's boost to defence funding, paradoxically, was a consequence of the government's failure to achieve a surplus. Had a surplus been within reach, the defence budget probably would have come under pressure. Certainly if it was if there was a gap to be filled, defence would have come under pressure. As it happened, there was a $21 billion blowout between the projected surplus and the recorded deficit for this financial year. Paradoxically, defence was a beneficiary of this fiscal blowout. That's because there's a binary political calculus at play. Australian government's net debt is small by international standards. Controversy over how you measure it but it's anywhere between 11% and 19%. It's chicken feed compared with European countries which are looking at 80%, or the United States looking at 80%. Plus they have very much larger unfunded pension liabilities than we have. Our superannuation policy of the 1990s is already bearing fruit and reducing future government liabilities. So all that matters is whether there's a surplus or not, because it's politically symbolic. The last time a Labor government delivered a surplus was 1989. It was, of enormous political value to them if they could have delivered a surplus this time around, and they couldn't. So, with a surplus out of reach, the impediments to constrained spending were weakened, and the Treasurer's loss became the Defence Minister's gain. It's a problem though, we're still not in surplus. Sometime in the next 3 years, whoever takes government in September will want to deliver a surplus. If it's Labor, they'll want to deliver a surplus so that the opposition can't say it's been more than a quarter of a century since they have. And the opposition will want to rob them of that politically valuable prize. Come hell or high water, there'll be a surplus in the next term of government. When that happens, the squeeze will be on again. Go back and have a look at the recession of the early 80s and the early 90s. What you find is the recession hits, defence spending is largely unaffected, and then you get to the point when the government is trying to get back into surplus, that's when the screws get put on. It happened in the 80s, happened in the 90s, and here's the surplus it wasn't. Here's a snapshot of what the fiscal situation looked like in May last year when the government was planning to deliver a surplus. You can see they were hoping to punch through in 2012, 2013, this financial year, with a small surplus. What we've got up here are cuts to the defence budget, deferrals to the defence budget, and you can see there's no accident here. There's no strategic circumstances changed, we'll readjust our defence spending. This is pure and simple. Let's raid defence in these years here in order to deliver a surplus in these years down here. Fiscal politics overrode the plans of the 2009 Defence White Paper. Now, sometime in the next 3 years, it's going to happen again. It would, maybe the economy will go great guns, but depending on who wins, there'll be, irrespective of who wins, there'll be the National Disability Insurance Scheme to fund. If the coalition wins, there's some taxes that will disappear, which will exacerbate the fiscal situation. If the present government is returned, we'll have the Gonski education reforms. They both have very rich, very politically popular agendas to pursue. It would be very optimistic to think that Defence will get away with not contributing to delivering a surplus. One of the reasons why both sides of politics are reticent to make any sort of substantive commitment in the long term about defence spending, certainly a commitment that would be commensurate with their plans, is that there's great uncertainty over future revenues, over what the fiscal situation will be. Economists have been busy near and far within government and outside looking at this new thing called a structural deficit. Apparently we picked it up in 2007, but nobody bothered telling us. It's like we went to the doctor and they kept the secret from us. What it means is that even when the economy returns to full capacity, when everyone is productively employed in the best sort of jobs our economy can give them, that revenues will be insufficient to cover all of government expenditure. So even after the GFC is ancient history. One of the reasons this has occurred is that Australia's terms of trade have gone the wrong way. There's been about a 17% deterioration in Australia's terms of trade. That's the amount of money we get in our currency for the things we sell, the things we export to other countries. Now, a 17% deterioration between late 2011 and the end of 2012 is one of the principal things which has driven the blowout, the $21 billion blowout in the fiscal situation today. It's still well above historical trend levels, the terms of trade. The budget projections that the government put out this year assume that between now and 2015, there will only be a further 2.5% deterioration in the terms of trade. Professor Ross Garno came out in the papers yesterday and thought there was another 20% of slack that could be taken up. So the downside risk is certainly there, that government revenues will be suppressed further at the same time as both sides of politics are going forward with agendas on the revenue side and on the expenditure side, which will only make things worse. So we're not out of the woods yet. Even if we get through the difficult times of delivering the surplus, the underlying structural fiscal situation that either side of politics will face when they come into government has a fair amount of downside risk. And if anything can be learned from what occurred in recent times, it's that if push comes to shove, if the government has to choose between the political expediency of delivering the surplus or maintaining its commitment to defence, it's a surplus that will win. So what's going on? It's a little hard to get a handle on exactly where the government's thinking's at. Although there was more breathing space given to the government this year as a result of the failure to get to surplus, funding defence, and they gave them an extra $3 billion over 4 years in this budget, funding defence the way they have was not pain-free. The cost of those 12 Growler aircraft I mentioned at $3 billion, that's actually more than the savings that they're getting from doing away with the baby bonus. Now, you don't have to think too hard to think which is the most politically expedient thing to do. Keeping the baby bonus would have made a lot of people happy. The Growler aircraft, well, chances are most of you hadn't heard of it before I told you. So why did the government do this? Well, they didn't even try to lay claim to some political mileage from it. The Treasurer's speech mentioned defence once in one sentence. It was almost as a perfunctory ticking the box as he went through. The Treasurer's speech was about entirely different issues. There's no votes in defence. So why incur the political cost and then underfund defence anyway? The most positive interpretation I can give is that the government is hedging. The government has decided that it thinks it needs a defence force, large, robust, the sort of defence force that we had planned back in 2009, but it's not willing to commit the money for it. It's keeping the option open, just providing enough money to keep the plans ticking over. The less charitable explanation is that they're avoiding hard decisions. One thing that will certainly emerge in the years ahead is the magic pudding will come back. Anyone who's observed defence over time would notice that every 4 or 5 years defence gets into trouble, a new reform program is announced, and billions and billions and billions of dollars is saved. The program falls over a couple of years later and everyone forgets about it, and the people who are in charge of it go off to different jobs and the cycle goes on again. That's probably unfair. In the past, defence has undergone some real reform. Outsourcing of a whole range of activities to the private sector has occurred. There's been some pooling of activities to develop economies of scale internally. They have done some real things. And if you have a look at defence, you'd think that there's a bit of room for some savings. What we've got here is the number of senior officers. That's people at the EL1 and EL2 level, and their military equivalents down the bottom here. Just for those of you who aren't public servants, we're talking about people paid between about $100 and $130,000 a year. These are seniorish middle managers. And you can see here between 2000 and 2013-14, we went from having a bit over 3,000 to having about 6,500 of them. Similarly on the military side, similar chart with smaller numbers for the senior executive service. There's been a big expansion there.
What rank would the senior military, would you be doing above?
Half colonel and colonel.
Half colonel.
These ones, yeah. But they get paid a bit more because they're in uniform. So, yes, there's a bit of fat in the system, but I could show you a chart like this for the federal police. I could show you one for Prime Minister and Cabinet. There's been an expansion of the public service across the board, and yeah, there's some savings to be made there, but my instinct is that the savings there aren't going to save the boat. They're not going to be sufficient to buy 12 advanced submarines or to maintain 2 combat fleets of aircraft. Similarly with outsourcing. Just about everything that isn't nailed down that could be outsourced has been outsourced in defence. There's a few areas left. You could put more estate management into the private sector's hands, but at the end of the day, when you outsource something, you talk about large numbers of people, but you don't get large savings. What you end up doing is you might take 1,000 people on the government payroll doing a job, and you replace them with 800 people from the private sector doing the job, because they're mean and tough and they make their people work harder and sweat more. But then you're probably paying 100 people's worth of profit to the firm that's doing it. So your savings, 100 people, it's 10%. It's 10% of the activity you're doing. So I don't think we're going to balance the books simply by pursuing efficiency measures of one sort or another. There's hard decisions there. Government's going to have to provide more money or decide on a less ambitious scheme for Australia's Defence Force. Let me change track now. Talked a lot about money, talked about current policy. What I want to go on now is talk about some of the big picture questions in defence policy, sort of things that I really, really hope in our discussion that follows we'll be able to grapple with. One of the first and the primordial question for anyone doing defence planning is, what do you want the Defence Force for? Now, very often that question doesn't get asked. Very often defence sort of leaps 2 or 3 levels up in the analysis and says, gee, submarines are getting old, we'd better replace the submarines. The aircraft are getting old, we'd better replace the aircraft. And the assumption is you just keep on doing what you're doing. If you can afford to do more is better than less. And that's, to a first approximation, how a lot of the public debate about defence occurs. Let me say that the first thing Australia should do is we should ask ourselves the question, defence against what? Now let me give you some options. None of these are mutually exclusive. There's different ways of slicing the cake, but let me give you a few. The first option is defence against nothing. Now I don't mean that flippantly. I had discussions with some visitors from France last week in Sydney, and they were talking about how they go about defence planning. I'm here to tell you, the Republic of France does not spend all of the money. They spend about 2.3% of GDP on defence. They don't spend that money because they think they need to defend themselves against anything. They don't think the Russian Federation is a threat. That's something they really, really don't worry about. There's a whole lot of other parts of Western Europe and Eastern Europe between them and Russia. They do that, they spend that money because it's part of their identity as a nation. A permanent member of the Security Council. When they're offended by something that's happening in Africa, as in Mali, they like to be able to roll up their sleeves and go and sort it out. They use armed force as an element of their foreign policy and their assertion of identity as a nation. Look at Great Britain's declared defence policy, and it says much the same thing. Their focus is on creating an expeditionary force that can go and do things, not because France or Great Britain's vital interests are going to be so perilously held to ransom that they need to do it. It's because that's what permanent members of the Security Council do in a world where people use armed force as part of international policy. And to some extent, Australia's possession of a defence force fulfills that goal. Whether it's a sufficient rationale for what we do, there's no question that Australia as a nation, setting aside the things we do for the purposes of keeping the alliance alive and delivering to us in various ways, to some extent, Australia uses armed force as its contribution to making the world a better place, irrespective of our interests really being engaged or not. You would have seen, certainly in this last term of government, a heightened sense of interest in Africa. Who cares about Africa? I I care about it because it's got human beings in it, it's an interesting place, so on and so forth. But no one from Africa is going to come and steal my lunch. It's not something I have to defend against. Second thing that we might want to defend against are the things where our interests are threatened, where no one else cares. And there's a few things like that. Let me give you some examples. One example is instability in East Timor, or in Solomon Islands, or, God forbid, in Papua New Guinea. If things go wrong there, if a humanitarian disaster of some sort occurs, a tidal wave, a famine, or civil unrest where people's lives are at risk, where innocent people are being murdered, I'm here to tell you no one else cares. If we don't sort it out, it won't get sorted out. We can more than likely get lots of people to come and help us if we take the lead, but we're going to have to be out there in the front doing it. It's a question of judgment as to how vital an interest that is, but it's certainly one of the things that if we want done, we're going to have to do ourselves. Secondly, SEA, Southeast Asia, it doesn't take too much imagination to think of a situation where Australia's interests are challenged by a nation in Southeast Asia, and where the United States goes, not taking sides here, guys. If you guys can't sort this out between yourselves, we're not getting involved militarily. It would be like our own Falkland Islands, where Great Britain stood aside and said the United States stood aside and said to Great Britain and the Argentinians, both being stupid, we're not going to help either of you. We could find ourselves in that sort of situation. Arguably, we came perilously close to it in 1999. So there's a set of things that Australia might reasonably aspire to do defence-wise, because we care about it and no one else will do it if we don't do it. The next thing you might want to do, or rather the next thing that other people might want us to do, is to play a role in maintaining the strategic balance in the Asia-Pacific. I've said Indo-Pacific because that's the latest catchphrase that the white paper put out. I don't think it adds a whole lot, to be honest. Really what we're talking about here is constraining China's capacity to use its rising power at the expense of other people's interests, US allies' interests. And there's a credible argument to be made that countries like Australia and South Korea and Japan and the United States should be getting ready to ensure that they militarily have the ability to dissuade China from taking even more provocative action than the sort of action they've taken in the South China Sea and the East China Sea in recent days. Finally, the most ambitious thing we might want to do is we might want to be Finland. Finland was a little nation that fought very tenaciously and managed to put the Soviet Union back in its box. Now, Professor Hugh White argues that Australia should aspire to have the ability to use conventional military means to sufficiently to impose sufficient costs on China that China can't militarily coerce us or compromise our interests in a big way. Any extremist attackers. So escalating a series of things that we might want to defend against. So what's the white paper say? Well, to be honest, the white paper isn't all that forthcoming. It isn't all that clear about what it wants to do. Because its predecessor in 2009 literally, figuratively, poked China in the eye, this year's white paper is at extraordinary pains to really not take sides, not to take a position, not to impugn any sort of sense that there's a risk associated with China. So to work out what's actually going on, you have to look at what the decisions are, what it is the white paper's doing. Well, the first point to make is it's more or less the same force structure as 2009. So, story changes, but the substance stays the same. But it doesn't quite stay the same. Where we have made changes, the narrowing from the range of submarines to the long-range submarines, the ones that would allow Australia to operate in the East China Sea, for example, and the fact that we're now literally going to have a combat air fleet of literally the best aircraft that anyone will sell us. Or to put it another way, aircraft that will overmatch anything that Southeast Asia would ever be likely to come up with. The signals are, from what the government's decisions in force structuring are, is that the government is actually worried, with actually hedging against a deterioration in the balance of power in the Asia Pacific, resulting from a breakdown of the relationship between China and the United States. Precisely the thing it tries to tell us we shouldn't have to worry about. Now, I don't think there's a great strategy behind this. I think what we're seeing here, I think what we saw in 2009 is a wish list that resulted from a whole bunch of money sloshing around in the defence sector, and the three services coming forward with the most ambitious proposals they could on each and every front. I think the issue of China actually is playing out there, but only in terms of creating an environment which makes it easier to justify big ticket, high-end acquisitions. I don't think there's a thought through strategy behind it. Let me say a little bit about strategies. I think Australia really has three broad options for defence. The first one would be what I'd call small defence. That would be a defence force that could do that second task I talked about. Could stabilise in the region and provide a sufficient level of capability to ensure that no one in Southeast Asia challenged our interests. But I think that's likely, but you know, it would be better to have that capacity than not have that capacity. It's not New Zealand. It's not a defence force with no air combat capability, but it's a defence force that doesn't benchmark its capability against the best assets that are available in North Asia. It benchmarks the sophistication of those assets against a lower benchmark. That's one option. The second option is the sort of option that Professor White or Professor Ross Babbage has put forward. 200 joint strike fighters, 24 or 36 submarines. It's a defence posture which is predicated on the assumption that if Australia spends enough money, it will have the strategic weight, is the term its proponents use, is strategic weight to make a difference in the big picture of Asia Pacific politics in the 21st century. I'm sceptical. My view is that if you look at the projections of economic weight going forward across the region, Australia has about as much chance of using military means to shape the future of the Asia Pacific as Denmark had of shaping the future of Europe in the 1930s. I think we risk spending an awful lot of money on an awful lot of very sophisticated equipment and really still not getting anywhere near the threshold of being able to make a difference. And of course, the final one is the Goldilocks Defence Force. It's kind of where I think we are at the moment. It's a defence force that it's not too small, not too large. It's got some superfluous aspects to it, long-range submarines, so on and so forth. But it makes us feel a bit more secure. Whether there's actually a strategy where that force structure actually makes us more secure than a small defence posture, I think is a highly debatable point. Almost out of time, so let me very quickly go through with a little bit of prophecy. What do I think will occur? There'll be more efficiency and reform, especially if the coalition comes in. They've already said they're going to impose some stringencies on defence and the public service as a whole. Some savings to be made, that's a good thing. There's also a danger that the baby will be thrown out in the bathwater. At the end of the day, it's not going to balance the books one way or the other. There'll be a debate. There'll be a debate below what I've been talking about here, sort of big picture stuff about matching strategy and force structure. There'll be a debate about, should we cut the army or should we have a smaller army or should we have fitted for but not with frigates? It's a question of where you want to take your risk. Do you want to take your risk of not being able to handle a breakdown of law and order in Papua New Guinea, or do you want to take the risk that your air and maritime platforms won't be ready if some high-end threat comes? And we'll go through that debate. My guess is the maritime, the air and naval forces will prevail and the army will be cut. I actually think we'll be leaving ourselves open to some rather nasty risks in the immediate region of not being able to do the sort of stabilisation operations which we've seen over the last decade can occur very quickly with little warning and can raise great expectations, not just among the Australian people, but among regional countries of what Australia will do. I think if you look back in history, where we are now is not unique. This isn't the first time there's been a plan for the Defence Force which was bigger than the wallet that was given to Defence at the time. The 87 White Paper had grand plans. The result was the 1991 Force Structure Review, which saw the size of the Army cut and a whole range of activities outsourced. In 2003, the Defence Capability Review did the same thing to the 2000 White Paper. But because we were using the Army at that time, it didn't cut the Army, it actually cut 2 frigates, 2 mine hunters, and accelerated the retirement of the F-111s when that lands. At some point there'll be a crunch, there'll be a review called, some learned professor from somewhere will come and kick the tyres of the ADF and advise the government on what to cut and what to keep. The biggest thing that's going to shape our Defence Force in the years ahead is events that haven't occurred. If there's a clash in the South China Sea where one side is shown to be irresponsible and aggressive over the other, then that could well catalyse the Australian government to spend a lot more on defence. Whether that fits into a strategy that would actually give us better outcomes in the long run doesn't really matter. If bad things happen, more money will be spent on defence. Conversely, if as Professor Garneau suggests, the terms of trade deteriorate by another 20%, or Chinese economy falters and sort of demand for our resources goes down, economic times going bad could see us trim our sails and have a much more modest approach to our defence. And I've just run out of time, so I'll leave it there. Happy to answer any questions.